behind the horizon, painting the snow-covered mountain peaks with a radiant golden orm glow. Deep in the wilderness of Montana, a small wooden cabin stood in solitude, nestled among towering pines and silent streams. This was where Ethan Carter, a retired park ranger, had chosen to retreat after years of dedicating his life to protecting nature. Ethan had once been a seasoned guardian of the wild, fighting tirelessly for conservation and the protection of wildlife. But after losing his beloved wife, Emma, to a relentless illness, he no longer felt a place in the bustling world beyond the trees. Grief-stricken, he abandoned city life and retreated to the remote forest cabin, the very place he and Emma had once dreamed of spending their final years together. The cabin was isolated from modern civilization, surrounded only by endless pine forests, crystal-clear creeks, and towering cliffs that stood like nature's fortress. Ethan's days passed in silence. Mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch, listening to the whisper of the wind through the trees, and nights spent by the fireplace, rereading Emma's old journal, her gentle voice echoing in his memories. This winter arrived earlier than expected. The wind carried the first flakes of snow, blanketing the forest in white. Ethan was no stranger to the harshness of nature, but he had no idea that this particular winter would bring an event that would change his life forever. That evening he sat in front of the fire, his fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea. On the windowsill, an old photograph of Emma rested, her kind smile watching over him like a silent guardian. Then, a sound shattered the stillness of the night. At first it was faint, like the distant howling of the wind slipping through the cracks of the cabin, but soon it grew clearer. A low, guttural cry filled with pain and desperation. A sound not belonging to a human. Ethan set his cup down immediately, grabbing his flashlight and the hunting knife strapped to his belt. His instincts as a ranger remained sharp. He stepped outside, the freezing air biting at his skin, the wind whipping snow into the air. The cry continued, guiding him toward the edge of the forest. An unsettling feeling rose in his chest. And then he saw it. Under the dim beam of his flashlight, a mother black bear lay curled on the frozen ground, her massive body trembling in pain. One of her front legs was caught in a rusted metal trap, the cruel kind that had long been outlawed but still lurked in the woods, left behind by poachers. Her deep amber eyes locked onto Ethan's, not with anger or panic, but with something else, something unexpected. A plea. Ethan held his breath. Throughout his years as a ranger, he had encountered countless animals trapped and suffering at the hands of hunters, but never had he seen a bear look at him like this. The pain in her eyes was not just physical. It was the look of a mother on the brink of despair. Then, something made Ethan's blood run cold. Next to the bear's large paw prints were smaller tracks. Bear cubs. His chest tightened. If the mother bear died here, her cubs wouldn't survive the brutal winter. Standing there with the icy wind cutting through him, Ethan realized he was facing a choice. One that could change his life. He could turn back, return to the warmth of his cabin, and pretend he had never seen this. Or he could do what he knew was right. As he stared into the bear's eyes, Ethan already knew his answer. And he didn't hesitate. Ethan tightened his grip on the flashlight, his breath turning into white mist in the freezing air. His eyes never left the trembling mother bear before him. The rusted metal trap clamped mercilessly around her front leg, the dried blood forming dark patches on her thick fur. But what worried Ethan even more were the small paw prints pressed into the snow nearby. The cubs. He swept his flashlight across the area, searching for any sign of the little ones. The wind howled through the trees, kicking up loose snow that obscured the ground. Nothing but barren trunks and an endless darkness. But he knew. They were out there, hiding, or worse, lost and wandering in the approaching snowstorm. Ethan turned his gaze back to the mother bear. She was exhausted. Pain and cold had drained most of her strength. She no longer struggled. She only lay there, panting, her amber eyes filled with fear and helplessness. He hesitated. A part of him was wary. This was still a wild animal, and in a state of panic, she could attack at any moment. But another part of him, the part that had spent his life protecting nature, could not stand by and watch a suffering creature plead for help. Slowly he lowered himself, making sure not to make any sudden movements. "It's okay, girl," he murmured, his voice low and soothing as if he were speaking to a frightened child. "I'm going to help you." The mother bear let out a low, pained whimper, blinking as if she understood. Ethan set the flashlight down, pulled his hunting knife from his belt, and cautiously reached toward the trap. He examined its locking mechanism, an old-fashioned spring trap, still powerful enough to crush bone if the bear pulled too hard. If he wasn't careful, he could make things worse. As he carefully worked on the rusted metal, a faint cry echoed through the trees. Ethan froze, turning toward the sound. It was a weak, desperate whimper, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable. The cry of a bear cub. For a moment he stood still, processing the weight of what that meant. If the cubs were alive, they were close. But a more urgent thought gripped him. Could they survive this brutal cold much longer? The mother bear heard it too. Her eyes widened, and despite her exhaustion, a mother's instinct surged through her. She attempted to rise, only for the trap to hold her back, making her cry out in pain as she collapsed again. Ethan knew he was out of time. He took a deep breath, refocusing on the trap. Pressing both sides of the locking mechanism, he felt the steel's tension beneath his numbing fingers. His muscles strained, the cold metal burning against his skin. Then, with a sharp snap, the trap's jaws finally released. The bear immediately jerked her leg free, stumbling backward, panting. Ethan quickly stepped away, keeping a safe distance. He had no idea how she would react. Would she lash out in fear or flee? But she did neither. Instead, she turned toward the forest, ears pricked, listening. The cubs' cries had grown fainter. The mother bear took a limping step forward, dragging her injured leg. But the fear in her eyes was gone. Now it was only determination. Ethan watched, heart pounding. He could not let her go alone. In her current state, if the wound didn't kill her, the bitter cold of winter would, along with her cubs. Without a second thought, he grabbed his flashlight, tightened his grip on his knife, and followed her. Underscore, 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 underscore. Episode. The Art of Coarse Silence. Where? Oral therapy. The journey through the darkened forest was treacherous. Trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The ground was uneven, covered in thick drifts that made each step a challenge. Cold seeped into Ethan's clothes, chilling him to the bone. But he pushed on, keeping his light trained on the bear as she stumbled forward, guided only by the weak cries of her cubs. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a massive tree with thick, twisted roots, forming a small hollow beneath it. And there, huddled in the darkness, were two tiny figures. The bear cubs. They were curled up tightly, their small bodies trembling, their fur speckled with ice. Their round, frightened eyes locked onto their mother, their whimpers turning into soft, hopeful cries. At the sight of her, they struggled to their feet, weak but alive. Ethan stood frozen, witnessing the reunion. The mother bear lowered her head, licking each cub gently, her breath warming their fragile bodies. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. The mother was still badly injured. The cubs were too weak. If they stayed out here, the cold and starvation would kill them all. Taking a cautious step forward, he spoke softly. "Listen, I can't let you die out here." He knew she couldn't understand his words, but his tone carried the weight of his intent. "I have a cabin, food, a fire. If you come with me, I can help you and your cubs survive." The mother bear lifted her head, staring at him. Ethan held his breath. He didn't know if she would trust him or not. Then, to his absolute astonishment, she took a step toward him. No aggression, no fear. Just a quiet, deliberate movement, as if she were considering his offer. And in that moment, Ethan knew there was no turning back. He would bring them to the cabin. He would save them. Ethan felt his heart pounding as the mother bear limped closer. Her amber eyes glowed with caution, but there was no fear, no aggression. There was only desperation, a silent plea from a mother putting her trust in a man she had never known. The freezing wind whipped against Ethan's face, carrying flurries of snow from the towering pine trees above. The mother bear stood just a few steps away, her massive chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Beneath the shelter of the gnarled tree roots, the two cubs trembled, their small cries barely audible over the howling storm. Ethan knelt down, reaching into his backpack. Slowly he pulled out a thick woolen blanket, one he always carried for long photography expeditions in the wilderness. With deliberate movements, he spread it out on the snow, then gestured gently toward the mother bear. "They need warmth," he said softly, knowing she couldn't understand his words. But she watched him, then turned to her cubs, as if weighing her options. After a moment, she nudged them forward. Ethan held his breath. This wasn't instinct. This was trust. Carefully, he wrapped the cubs in the blanket, feeling their tiny bodies shudder against the cold fabric. They were too weak. If they didn't get warmth and nourishment soon, their chances of survival would dwindle rapidly. But how could he get them back to the cabin safely? Ethan's eyes flicked to the mother bear's injured leg, still bleeding, though the wound had partially clotted. She was in no condition to travel far, and the cubs were too weak to walk. If they remained here, the blizzard would turn the forest into an icy grave. He needed another way. Ethan inhaled sharply, scanning the dense forest. He knew this area well. About a mile away, a narrow path led directly to his cabin. It was the shortest route, but also the most dangerous, with the storm growing fiercer by the minute. He turned back to the mother bear. She was barely standing, yet her eyes remained filled with resolve. Ethan knelt beside her, opening his pack once more. He retrieved a roll of clean bandages and a small bottle of antiseptic. "This is going to hurt," he murmured. Slowly, he dabbed the antiseptic over the wound, his fingers stiff from the cold. The bear flinched but did not resist. He wrapped the bandage around her leg as best as he could. It wouldn't heal the injury, but it might prevent an infection. The only thing that could truly help now was time, and time was something they didn't have. Once finished, Ethan turned to the cubs. They had fallen into an exhausted sleep inside the blanket. He knew he couldn't carry them both in his arms while navigating the snowstorm. A thought struck him. He shrugged off his thick jacket and carefully wrapped the cubs inside, forming a makeshift pouch. Then, pulling a rope from his pack, he secured the bundle across his chest, ensuring the cubs were snug against his body. He tested the weight. Heavy, but manageable. The mother bear watched him, her gaze shifting between him and her cubs. Worry flickered in her tired eyes. "They'll be all right," Ethan reassured, adjusting the rope. Then he took a step forward. The mother bear limped behind him. The trek back through the blizzard was brutal. The wind roared, biting through Ethan's clothes, and the thick snow made every step an effort. He pressed forward, feeling the weight of the cubs shifting against him with each movement. After nearly an hour of battling the elements, the faint glow of his cabin's lantern came into view. Relief surged through him. "We're almost home," he whispered. The mother bear hesitated at the cabin's doorstep. Her instincts screamed at her to stay away from human territory. But then, from inside Ethan's jacket, the cubs let out faint whimpers. That was all it took. She stepped inside. Ethan shut the door behind them, sealing out the storm. Inside, warmth from the fireplace filled the air. Ethan gently laid the cubs down on a thick rug near the fire and unwrapped them from his jacket. They stirred weakly, but remained too exhausted to move. Without wasting time, Ethan poured some warm milk into a small bowl. He had no feeding bottle, but he found an old syringe in his first aid kit. One drop at a time, he coaxed the liquid into the cubs' mouths. At first, they didn't react, but then one of them flicked its tongue and began to drink. A spark of hope ignited in Ethan's chest. The mother bear lowered herself beside her cubs, her breathing still heavy, but for the first time her expression softened. Ethan slumped into his chair, muscles aching, exhaustion pressing down on him. He had done everything he could. Now, all he could do was wait and hope they would make it through the night. He gazed at the bear and her cubs curled up near the fire. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't alone. And somehow, in the heart of the storm, he knew this was the right thing to do. The blizzard outside continued its relentless assault, hammering against the wooden walls of the cabin, rattling the windows with each furious gust. The fireplace burned brightly, casting a warm glow that barely held back the biting cold. But inside, Ethan knew that the battle for survival was far from over. The two bear cubs lay motionless on the thick rug near the fire, their tiny chests rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths. The mother bear lay beside them, her tired amber eyes locked onto their frail bodies, filled with unspoken worry. Even though they were now safe from the storm, their small frames were still far too weak. Ethan frowned, carefully checking the cubs. One of them twitched slightly, but the other remained still. Too still. That couldn't happen. He couldn't let them die. Heart pounding, he rushed to the medicine cabinet, rummaging through old bottles and supplies. Among the worn-out labels, he found a small vial of glucose syrup, something he had kept for himself during long, grueling hikes when exhaustion threatened to overtake him. This might be their only chance. Ethan poured a few drops onto a spoon, then gently lifted the weaker cub's tiny head. Its mouth was too small to drink normally, but he remembered that weakened animals could sometimes absorb liquids through their gums. Taking a soft cloth, he dipped it into the syrup and carefully rubbed it against the cub's gums, drop by drop. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. No response. Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling dread coil tightly in his chest, but then a twitch. The cub let out the faintest whimper, barely audible, but there. It weakly moved its tiny legs, as if fighting to hold on to life. Ethan exhaled in relief, continuing to rub the glucose into its mouth. The mother bear rumbled lowly beside him, her gaze shifting from her cub to him, as if understanding that he was trying to help. Then, a loud crash outside. Ethan jolted, his instincts snapping to high alert. He spun toward the window just in time to see a massive pine tree, battered by the storm, come crashing down near the cabin, sending a spray of snow flying into the air. The wind howled louder, but beneath it, something else. A sound. Not just the storm. Something was out there. Ethan grabbed his rifle from the wall. Not to attack, but to be ready. His pulse pounded in his ears as he carefully pulled the safety lever and stepped toward the window. The world outside was a blur of white, but in the distance, near the tree line, he saw it. A shadow. Not a bear, not a deer. A wolf. It stood motionless, its piercing eyes glowing against the darkness, reflecting the flickering cabin light. But what made Ethan's stomach drop was that it wasn't alone. More shadows moved behind it. A pack. Ethan's spine went rigid. These weren't just wandering wolves. They were hunting. The storm had made food scarce, and a wounded bear with 2 defenseless cubs would be an irresistible opportunity. The mother bear had sensed it too. She slowly pushed herself up, positioning herself between her cubs and the door. Though her injury made her stagger, the protective fire in her eyes burned fiercely. Even in her weakened state, she would fight to the last breath. Ethan knew he couldn't let that happen. Moving swiftly, he bolted the door shut, but wolves were patient hunters. If they decided to encircle the cabin and wait, they could be trapped inside for hours, maybe longer. He needed a way to drive them off. His mind raced. Wolves were smart, wolves were deadly, but even the fiercest of them still feared fire. Ethan grabbed a burning log from the fireplace, gripping it tightly as he stepped to the window. He shoved it outside, waving it in the air. The sudden burst of light made the wolves flinch. They growled, low and menacing, but held their ground. They weren't leaving? Ethan needed something stronger. Then an idea. In the storage shed, he had gasoline kept for the generator. It wasn't something he wanted to waste, but there was no other choice. Without hesitation, he grabbed a canister, pried the lid off, and splashed a thin line across the snow just beyond the porch, with one final flick of the burning log. Whoosh! Flames erupted, forming a wall of fire between the cabin and the prowling wolves. The pack recoiled, startled, growling in frustration. One of them, the leader perhaps, stood firm, its gaze locked onto Ethan. But eventually they backed off, slinking away into the forest. For now, Ethan slammed the door shut, chest heaving. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the adrenaline still surging through his veins. Turning back, he saw the mother bear still standing protectively over her cubs. She had watched everything. She understood. She knew Ethan had just saved them from something far worse than the storm. The cubs had settled, their breathing steadier. Their fragile lives were still at risk, but at least, for tonight, they had survived. Ethan dropped into his chair, staring at the fire. His entire world had changed in a single night. His fate and the fate of these bears were now forever intertwined. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the cold remained merciless. Snow continued piling onto the cabin's roof, creating an ever-growing weight that worried Ethan. The blizzard might pass soon, but time was now their greatest enemy. The mother bear, though treated for her wound, was still weak. She lay near the fireplace, her eyes half open, her breathing heavy. The two cubs had shown signs of recovery, but they remained vulnerable, needing warmth and care. Seeing this, Ethan knew one thing. If he didn't act now, they might not survive the unforgiving winter. Ethan knelt beside the mother bear, carefully checking the wound on her shoulder. The bandages were stained with blood, but there was no sign of infection. That was good news. The real problem, however, was that she still couldn't move properly. If she couldn't walk, they wouldn't be able to leave before the snow buried every possible path. Ethan inhaled deeply, trying to think. Taking them back into the wild? No, the snow was too thick and they weren't strong enough yet. Keeping them in the cabin? Also not ideal. His food supply was limited, and once the snow blocked off everything, they would all be trapped. Ethan scanned the cabin, searching for a solution. If he wanted to get the bear and her cubs to safety, he needed a way to transport them. Something sturdy enough to carry their weight without worsening the mother bear's injury. Then his eyes landed on something in the corner of the room. A sled. It was old but reliable, the same sled he used to haul firewood from the forest each winter. If he reinforced it properly, it might be able to carry the mother bear and her cubs safely. Without wasting time, Ethan grabbed some extra rope and wooden planks, reinforcing the sled's base for additional support. Then he layered thick blankets and dry straw to create a warm, cushioned surface. But another challenge arose. How could he convince the mother bear to climb onto it? Ethan knelt beside the bear, speaking softly. "You have to trust me. If you don't move now, you might not get another chance." She slowly blinked at him, exhausted. Thinking quickly, Ethan remembered something. Honey. He had a jar of it in the kitchen, something he had kept for years. If there was one thing he knew about bears, it was their love for honey. He carefully poured a small amount onto the sled, letting its golden sweetness glisten under the dim cabin light. The bear's nose twitched. Her exhausted body barely moved, but her instincts awakened at the familiar scent. With an incredible effort, she slowly pulled herself up, dragging her heavy body toward the sled. The cubs, seeing their mother move, followed closely behind. Ethan held his breath, gripping the sled's ropes. Finally, with a final push, the mother bear settled onto the sled. She was on. Ethan tightened his grip on the rope and took a deep breath. The journey had begun. The snow was deep and unforgiving, but Ethan pushed forward, pulling the sled with everything he had. Each step was a struggle, his boots sinking into the thick snow. His muscles burned, his breath coming out in harsh gasps, but he refused to stop. Beneath the thick blankets, the mother bear breathed shallowly, her cubs nestled close, absorbing whatever warmth they could. The distance from the cabin to the forest wasn't far, but in these conditions it felt like miles. Ethan's hands numbed from the freezing wind, but he kept going. Just a little more. Then he heard it. A low, haunting howl. His heart stopped. Wolves. Ethan turned sharply and saw them. Through the misty snowfall, dark figures moved along the tree line. They weren't attacking. Not yet. But they were watching. Ethan tightened his grip on the sled rope. He had to move faster. If the wolves saw weakness, they would attack. A wounded mother bear with 2 defenseless cubs? An easy target. Gritting his teeth, Ethan pushed forward. The wind whipped against his face. Snow blurred his vision. His legs felt like lead. Then, one of the wolves broke ahead. Ethan's pulse spiked. He could hear it growling, circling closer. He had one chance. With a swift movement, he grabbed his rifle, raised it, and fired into the sky. Boom! Boom! The gunshot echoed through the frozen landscape. The wolves froze. Some of them stepped back, uncertain. But the pack leaders stood its ground, snarling. Ethan had no time to hesitate. He pushed forward one last time, dragging the sled into the forest, straight toward the rocky cliffs. Just ahead was a cave. One Ethan had scouted years ago. It would be the perfect shelter. As soon as he reached the entrance, Ethan let go of the rope, dropping to his knees in exhaustion. The mother bear stirred. She seemed to understand. They had reached safety. With slow, deliberate movements, she lifted herself up and limped into the cave. Her cubs, still weak, followed. Ethan sat on a rock, gasping for breath. They had made it. The wolves remained, their silhouettes dark against the snowy backdrop. But they wouldn't enter the cave. They knew the hunt was over. After a few moments, they turned away, vanishing into the white abyss of the storm. Ethan leaned back against the cave wall, staring up at the night sky. The snow still fell, but it no longer felt as cold. Because tonight he knew he was no longer alone. Beneath the starry sky, in the depths of the wild, an unbreakable bond had formed. A silent understanding between man and nature. The storm had passed, but its aftermath remained throughout the forest. Broken branches were scattered across the ground, thick layers of snow covered every inch of the woods, and a deep silence hung in the air, as if nature itself was catching its breath after the raging blizzard. Ethan sat leaning against a tree just outside the cave, his gaze fixed on the misty forest bathed in the soft light of dawn. His body ached, every muscle sore after the grueling journey. But deep inside he felt something strange. Relief, warmth, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. From inside the cave, the mother bear slowly emerged. For the first time since Ethan had found her, she stood on all 4 legs without collapsing. Her amber eyes no longer carried the dull haze of exhaustion, but instead shone with newfound clarity. Though the wound on her shoulder was still healing, she no longer lay motionless, drained of strength. Her 2 cubs waddled behind her, their curious eyes darting around as they took in the morning light. They no longer trembled from the cold. Instead, they were full of life, scampering playfully around their mother, occasionally turning back to glance at Ethan with innocent wonder. A faint smile formed on Ethan's lips. They were going to survive. He stretched, trying to shake off the stiffness in his limbs, then slowly approached the mother bear, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "You're looking better, aren't you?" he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. The mother bear turned her head, looking at him. There was no fear in her eyes, no hostility, only a quiet understanding. Then something happened that Ethan never expected. The mother bear took slow, deliberate steps forward. The cubs hesitated at first, glancing between their mother and Ethan, but eventually they followed. Ethan held his breath. He remained perfectly still, making no sudden movements. And then, in an act that sent chills down his spine, the mother bear stopped right in front of him, lowered her head, and gently pressed her nose against his hand. Just for a moment. But for Ethan, that moment meant everything. His vision blurred as emotions welled up inside him. Was this her way of saying thank you? He didn't know, but he knew one thing. This was not just a wild animal. She was a living being, full of emotion, understanding, and gratitude. Then, just as gently as she had come, the mother bear stepped back. She let out a deep, low rumble, then turned away. The cubs lingered for a second, reluctant to leave, but when their mother called, they followed. Ethan stood frozen, watching as they disappeared into the trees. The mother bear and her cubs were ready to return to the wild. And Ethan knew it was time to let them go. He watched their figures fade into the snow-covered forest, feeling a strange mix of loss and fulfillment. It wasn't sadness. It was something more complete. Before vanishing completely, the mother bear looked back one last time. Ethan raised a hand in farewell. Then she was gone. He stood there for a long time, staring at the quiet forest. Then he turned back toward the cabin, knowing his life would never be the same again. As Ethan stepped into his cabin, everything felt different. The golden sunlight streaming through the windows seemed warmer. The trees and the snow outside seemed more alive. But most importantly, he felt different. For years he had chosen isolation. He had shut himself away from the world, from people, from everything. But in just a few days, he had opened his heart again. Nature no longer felt like a distant, cold place. It had become a part of him, and somehow he had become a part of it. In the following days, Ethan resumed his normal routine, but each day felt different now. He began writing down his story in an old leather-bound journal, documenting the mother bear, the blizzard, the night they shared in the cabin, and the moment she had touched his hand. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had something worth sharing with the world. One morning, as Ethan sat on his porch sipping a warm cup of tea, his gaze drifted toward the forest. Something was different. At the edge of the trees, 3 familiar figures stood quietly, half hidden behind the branches. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The mother bear had returned. Her cubs, now slightly bigger, stronger, and more confident, flanked her sides. They didn't approach the cabin, but they didn't leave right away either. They simply stood there, as if to remind him that the bond they had formed still remained. Ethan smiled. He didn't wave, he didn't call out. He just sat there, watching. And after a moment, the mother bear let out a soft, low growl. Her cubs chirped excitedly, then turned and followed their mother back into the depths of the wild. Ethan exhaled slowly, taking another sip of his tea. He knew this wouldn't be the last time. One day, when winter had passed, when the snow had melted away, he would see them again. And this time, he wouldn't feel alone. Because between man and nature, there is a connection that defies all boundaries. Winter gradually faded, leaving behind its final traces on the wild landscape. The lake near Ethan's cabin began to thaw, its crystal-clear waters flowing through the rocky crevices, carrying the breath of spring back into the land. Though he no longer saw the mother bear and her cubs lingering near the cabin, Ethan knew that somewhere beyond the towering pines, they were still living, growing, continuing their journey. And that knowledge brought him a peace he had never felt before. After those life or math days in the storm, Ethan was no longer the same man who once lived in solitude. That encounter had changed him in ways he never could have imagined. Before, he had lived like a shadow in his old cabin, avoiding the world, rejecting all connections. But now, he understood that nature was not something to fear or escape. It was a part of him. He started spending more time observing the forest, listening to the sounds of life around him. The photographs he took were no longer just simple landscapes. They were stories. The bear tracks in the snow, the broken branches left behind by the storm, the golden rays of sunrise filtering through the treetops. All became pieces of a journey he never expected to take. Ethan also began writing his experiences in an old notebook, documenting the mother bear and her cubs, how they had changed his life. One day, he decided to submit his first article to a wildlife magazine, and soon it was published under the title, The Man and the Bear, a story of compassion and a connection beyond species. The story spread quickly, not just within his small town, but to researchers, conservationists, and nature lovers everywhere. People weren't just moved by Ethan's kindness. They were astonished by the mother bear's remarkable behavior, something almost unheard of in the wild. Looking back at everything, Ethan realized that life wasn't just about survival, it was about connection. For years he had believed that to avoid pain he needed to isolate himself from people, from the world, from everything. But the moment he opened his door to a dying creature, he found himself again. He learned that no one can truly live alone. Compassion isn't just for humans, it extends to all living beings. Nature isn't just something to observe, it's a place where we belong. And the most important lesson, sometimes, the most unexpected moments are the ones that save a lost soul. One morning, as Ethan sat on his porch, sipping a hot cup of tea and flipping through the pages of his journal, he heard a familiar sound, the soft crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. He lifted his head. At the edge of the forest, a familiar figure appeared. The mother bear. Her cubs, now bigger, stronger, stood beside her, their curious eyes gazing in his direction. Ethan smiled but remained still. He simply watched. The mother bear stood motionless for a moment, her amber eyes locked onto his. Then, in what felt like one final gesture of gratitude, she lowered her head slightly. The moment made Ethan's throat tighten. And then, just as gracefully as she had come, the mother bear turned away, leading her cubs back into the wilderness. But this time, Ethan didn't feel loss, because he knew that the connection between him and them would never truly fade.